Good evening. My name is Emmanuelle Saada. I'm the chair of the Department of French at Columbia. Welcome to Columbia University in the city of New York. There is no way to ignore tonight that we are welcoming you at a moment of deep crisis for our institution. These are unprecedented, those are very new times. And we are currently living under existential threats to our ways of engaging the world. But crisis does not necessarily imply despair. Here and now, and at least tonight, and the next 2 days, let's focus for a short moment on reasons to hope. There is hope in the fact that we can be together here at Columbia, in the eyes of the storm, with friends and colleagues from Africa, Europe, and the US, who are here to celebrate Souleymane Bachir Diagne and his work in the next 2 days. And they will speak about African philosophy, socialism, universalism, and Ubuntu, a concept dear to Bachir that implies that from being together, we can become one. There is also a great deal of hope in the work of Bachir itself, past, present, and future. That hope rests for me on the persistent call to universalism, the topic of his talk tonight, or rather on the practice of universalizing, universaliser, a practice that doesn't mean the erasure of differences, but on the contrary, points to a dialogue across and through them. A direction that is so much needed at a time when any conversation is so damn difficult. This hope will be with us as we are celebrating Bachir's work tonight, tomorrow, and Saturday. The work of a scholar, and thus of a professor. From Boolean logic to the philosophy of Islam, from African philosophy to translation, Bachir's being in the world has been first and foremost that of a scholar steeped in the reading and discussing of texts in many different languages. There is, of course, an ethical and political proposition that follows from there, but not one that Bachir wears on his sleeves. It is more like a gesture toward the possible. Far from an easy activism, his work is always open to reason and subject to deliberation. And deliberate we will in the next days with 7 panels and 28 participants, all former students and colleagues, and sometimes students who became colleagues and friends. From Columbia, where Bachir has been teaching in the departments of French and philosophy since 2008, but also from Northwestern University, the University of Dakar, and further back in time, La Sorbonne, the École Normale Supérieure, and even the Lycée Louis le Grand. We would like to thank profusely all the participants for having accepted our invitation. We would like to thank you all, the audience, who have come from nearby, but also sometimes from very far, including several members of Bachir's family, many of them residents of Senegal, who came especially for this occasion. And they include so be a little patient because you can clap later. For Mariam Li Diagne, Sij Hamadou Diagne, Muhammadou Diagne, Abdallah Diagne, Maimouna Diagne, Khadija Toussek, Astou Ly, Mustafa Wane, and grandsons and granddaughter, Bachir, Ibrahima, and Yassine Marie Diagne, respectively 6, 3, and 7 months. Thank you for being here all. We are also honored by the presence of the permanent representative of Senegal to the United Nations, Mr. Koli Seck, as well as the General Counsel of Senegal in New York, Mr. Papa Ansoumana Diatta. This conference is organized by the Maison Française of Columbia University and the Department of French, with support of the Columbia's Institute of African Studies, the Office of the Dean of Humanities, the Department of Philosophy, the Committee on Global Thought, the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities, the Alliance Program, and the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies, also known as MESAAS, and also from the French Embassy's Villa Albertine. So thank you to all of our co-sponsors and supporters in the past month. There are many people here who have made this celebration and this celebration of hope possible, starting with Ethan Queso and Calder Singer and their team at the School of the Arts Lenfest Center. But the people who have been most crucial in putting together this event with an organization that started nearly a year ago and has involved hundreds of emails, dozens of meetings, and too many hours of work to count, are the Maison Française team, with its intern, Amy Schlosser, its associate director, Fanny Gay, and its visionary director, Shani Peer. We owe them a huge thank, and I think a round of applause. Another key supporter of this event, in more ways than one, is our Humanities Dean at Columbia, Bruno Bosteels, who shares a lot with Bachir, including an active interest in the practices of philosophy and translation. So I'm now calling on Dean Bosteels to introduce Bachir. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emmanuelle, for those hopeful words. It's a real pleasure to be here and to, for a moment, at least, put everything else on pause. I will keep this brief as an introduction to a dear colleague who I've enjoyed having also in ICLS, the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, where Bachir was on our executive committee. Souleymane Bachir Diagne was born in St. Louis, in Senegal, and received his academic training in France. An alumnus of the École Normale Supérieure in the Rue d'Ulm, he holds an agrégation in philosophy from 1978 and a doctorate in philosophy from the Sorbonne in 1988, where he also earned his BA. In 1982, Professor Diagne returned to his native country to teach philosophy at the Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar, where he became Vice Dean of the College of Humanities, something for which I'm not sure I should send him my congratulations or my condolences and sympathy. The former president of the Republic of Senegal, Abdou Diouf, named him Counselor for Education and Culture, a position which he had held from 1993 to 1999. Before joining Columbia University in 2008, Professor Diagne also taught philosophy at Northwestern University. His fields of research and teaching have included the history of logic, history of philosophy, Islamic philosophy, Sufism, and philosophy in the Islamic world, African philosophy, and literature. He is the author of a large number of books, among which I will only mention a few titles. The Ink of the Scholars, Reflections in Philosophy in Africa, from the Conseil pour le développement de la recherche en sciences sociales en Afrique of 2016. Open to Reason, Muslim Philosophers in Conversation with Western Tradition, from Columbia University Press, 2018. Le Fagot de ma Mémoire, Édition Philippe Rey, from 2021, which received the Prix Saint-Simon. De Langue à Langue, from Albin Michel in 2022, with an English translation, From Language to Language, The Hospitality of Translation, from the Other Press. And most recently, Universalism and Ubuntu, Entretien avec Françoise Blum, also both from 2024, with Albin Michel and the EHSS in Paris. His book, Bergson postcolonial, l'élan vital dans la pensée de Senghor et de Mohamed Iqbal, from Édition de CNRS, in 2011, was awarded the Dagnan Bouveret Prize by the French Academy of Moral and Political Sciences for 2011, when he also received the Édouard Glissant Prize for his work. His recent book, Universaliser l'humanité par les moyens de l'humanité, is exemplary of Professor Diagne's unique position in the public sphere, notable for his ability to make complex ideas accessible to a broad audience, while remaining committed to a deep intellectual engagement. He has a particular gift for bridging Western philosophical traditions with those of Africa and the Arab world, as well as Islam. His proposal for seeing universality as a verb, to universalize, universaliser, speaks to his commitment to transcultural and inter-religious dialogue, as well as to his advocacy for an inclusive modernity that embraces universal values such as liberty, justice, and solidarity. If these values defined a certain European tradition of Enlightenment universalism, beginning in the French, or perhaps more radically in the Haitian Revolution, the era of this European-inspired universalism may have come to a close in 1989 with the end of the Cold War, if not much earlier, in 1955, with the Bandung Conference that put decolonization on the agenda for all areas and fields of human experience, from art and museums to philosophy and the university. For Bachir, however, decolonization does not mean locking us into the triumphant relativism of windowless particularities. On the contrary, explicitly joining thinkers such as Léopold Sédar Senghor and Aimé Césaire, but also implicitly Sylvia Wynter, he calls for a new humanism and a new universalism, a universal humanism. And at the heart of this lifelong intellectual endeavor, we can see the pivotal role reserved for the study of language, literature, and the arts through practices of translation. Translations that are both linguistic and conceptual or epistemological. At a time when physical and ideological walls are being erected everywhere to keep humanity from living in common as the single species that we are, nothing seems to me more urgent and more significant than this will to translate and communicate across barriers between languages, religions, and nations, and with a cosmopolitan view of philosophy not limited to the single thread that supposedly links Athens and Rome directly to Heidelberg, but rather including a multiplicity of places and pathways that in addition run through Baghdad, Cordoba, or Bashir's native Saint-Louis. For his contribution to the task of universalizing, we will forever be in Bashir's debt. I am sure that we are all looking forward to his inaugural talk titled In Praise of the Universal. So to open this amazing conference in his honor, please join me in celebrating his career and his contributions to Colombia at a time when his kind of generosity, his kindness, and his eternal and contagious optimism are more needed than ever.
Thank you so much, Bruno. I understand that the record is 25 hours. Thank you so much, Bruno. Thank you so much, Emmanuelle. I will never have words to thank you enough for organizing this new, shiny, the whole Columbia community. Your Excellency, Senegalese Ambassador to the United Nations, Your Excellency, the General Consul of Senegal, I'm very, very honored that you have accepted Columbia invitation to be here and to represent our Senegalese community here in Senegal. Thank you very much. My dear colleagues, my dear friends, dear family, your presence at a time of turmoil in the world, in our Colombian community, touches me deeply. Thank you for being here. I was going to add, in spite of everything. But thank you for taking the time. And thank you to my departments of French and philosophy, to our dear Maison Française, and to the Institute of African Studies and every other institution here at Columbia for having decided to make my retirement this occasion for a very timely celebration of what weaves us together as a community with continuity and resilience against all disruptions. Solon, one of the 7 sages of Greece and the father of Athenian democracy, famously declared that nobody could be called happy until they are dead. As a Spinozist, as I like to consider myself, I know nothing about death. I only talk about life. So my own paraphrase of the wise Solon will be as follows. A professor can be declared to have lived a happy academic life if, when he retires, he is surrounded by friends among the brightest minds in their disciplines who are willing to share a moment of celebration and, for some of them, have a few words about his work. So here you are. Here you are. And the friendship you are showing me by your presence tells me that indeed my academic career is a happy one. During the coming couple of days, during each of the different panels, I will make sure to say a few words to thank each and every one of you, the panelists, but today I can only express in a very general way my gratitude to you, friends, colleagues, students, for everything my work and I personally owe you. And since they will not attend the panels, let me say now a few words to recognize my family, which is something that you wonderfully did already, Emmanuelle. I will start in a very Senegalese, Wolof, traditional way with the child of my mother, my sister Ramatoulaye, who is also here as my colleague from the Department of Philosophy of Cheikh Anta Diop University. My wife's sister, Astuli, their big brother, Amadou Mahtarli, and our other family members, Soukaina Diop, Mohamed Moj, our nephew, Mustafa Wan, and my niece, Miran Sarr. I renew my gratitude to Shani, to Fanny, to you, Emmanuelle, and all the organizers of this event for having accomplished a miracle that no holiday could accomplish. Have all my children decide that this is a time to buy plane tickets, fly home, since home is New York, and be with mom and dad. So thank you, Sheikh. Thank you, Muhammadu. Thank you, Khadija. Thank you, Maimuna. Thank you, Abdallah. You have added to your carbon footprint, but it is for the good cause. Thank you for yet another manifestation of your love, and for continuously illuminating my life, and for being here with my grandchildren. Last but certainly not least, my wife, Mariam Lee, who has not only added my last name to the one she got from her father, but has also kidnapped my middle name, Bachir. Bashir is the adjective corresponding to the noun Bushra, meaning happy news. Well, that name, Bashir, suits you perfectly. Mariam Bashir. And I'm blessed to have you by my side as a permanent and ever new Bushra. Let me now have my head talk praising the universal before I pour too much from my heart. I taught my first class as a not yet tenured associate professor at the University of Dakar on October 1982. It was room 76. That a few of you know very well here. The course was on the history of logic, from Leibniz to Frege. And actually, this is a class I have had the pleasure of co-teaching here at Columbia with Achille Varzi. On that first day of my first academic year, I presented to my Senegalese students les nouveaux essais sur l'entendement humain, the new essays on human understanding by Leibniz. And I discussed with them the goal of the philosopher to reconstruct the Adamic language that all human beings spoke before the curse of Babel happened, fragmenting humanity into tribes with different languages. And I'm looking at Christia, my very dear colleague from the philosophy department, who is this huge specialist of Leibniz, and it has been my pleasure, dear Christia, to talk about Leibniz and many other things with you. Leibniz, as I explained that day, believed in the construction of a universal Adamic language of algebraic logic that will be the pure language of our faculty of understanding when it is not obfuscated by the noise of our imagination or our passions. Through the reconstruction, first by Leibniz, then by George Boole, of that primal language spoken by all humans before the catastrophe of Babel, and which Leibniz called a lingua characteristica universalis, I have devoted my dissertation and my first two books exploring the history of the algebra of logic, which is the origin of our computer civilization, which is the origin of the binary system 0 and 1, which is the alphabet of our computers. Academic life has later led me from that consideration of the pure universal symbolism of computing to the question of the universal when considering the irreducible thickness of the different languages that we do speak, which are imperfect in that they are many, as French poet Stéphane Mallarmé famously said. The question I came to consider then could be posed as follows: what universal language after Babel? And the answer I have been exploring is the following: a universal of translation or a lateral universal, to evoke a concept coined by French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty. And I have been a happy co-teacher again many times with Peter Connor, my good friend and colleague Peter Connor, of a graduate seminar on translation studies. And dear Hamid Dabashi, we still have to co-teach a class. So now that I am kicked out of Columbia, you will have to invite me to your seminar, and I will be happy to say a few words, and we will be fulfilling the promise we made to each other to co-teach a class. Translation is a machine de guerre against cultural apartheid. We establish a cultural apartheid when we consider that cultures are insularities, that our different experiences are incommunicable singularities. Apartheid, as its etymology indicates, insists on frontiers with the idea that cultures must be protected from each other, or cultural appropriation will occur. When we understand cultures and identities in that way, public space is no longer public space. It is no longer an agora for dialogue and exchange. It becomes a place for juxtaposed performances of identities. And we would live then in a Babylonian world of tribes where untranslatability reigns. In the oblivion of the line by the playwright Terence from the 2nd century BC, Homo sum humani nihil a me alienum puto. I am human. I consider nothing human alien to me. A declaration that has become the motto of humanism. Against such a vision goes Walter Benjamin's notion of translation as the path to what he calls the pure language, which can be understood as the universal Adamic mother tongue. In his famous essay, The Task of the Translator, Benjamin explains the encounter with such a pure language, the intuition, the presentiment that the translation experiences when she gives hospitality in one language to what has been thought and created in another. That virtual third language that presents itself and exists only in that moment and in that experience of translating is the language of our shared humanity. This is the topic of my book, From Language to Language, The Hospitality of Translation, that Emmanuelle has mentioned, and so did Bruno, which I was going to present it to you because it is imminent that it comes out. But we did not get copies on time. But I'm delighted to say that it has been translated from the French original by Dylan Temmel, an alum from our French department, and the students that I have been blessed to have in my classes. The experience, the best experience I had during this career is that 3 times my work has been translated by my own student. And I did not even know they had that in mind. My first book translated into English was translated by Chike Jeffers, who could not be with us here. And just one day I received an email with an attachment from him. And I started reading the attachment. I say, this sounds familiar. And it was pages from my book in English. This is what Chike did that day. Same thing with Dylan also. He did not even dare ask me. He went through Fanny, who told me, you know what, Dylan would like to translate your book. And since I mentioned in my book that the best idea of translation, the ethics of translation, is when you fall in love with something and you feel compelled to translate it, I could not but say to him, yes, indeed. And I was happy to be able to convince Judith Gurevich to just drop her professional translators and ask Dylan to do it, and he did a wonderful, wonderful job. Having talked about Babel, I cannot resist reading from the biblical narrative of the catastrophe of Babel in Genesis 1:9. Preaching the Bible has been always my dream. Thank you for making it possible. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. This is why it was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. This condemnation marks the end of the Adamic language and represents a new fall for the human being after the first one that took him out of the Edenic state he first enjoyed. Babel stands for the ontological loss, that is the fall of humans into the plurality of innumerable different languages, into the many nations of tribes that we constitute. Beyond its religious significance, this story speaks to us of our human condition, which is the plural face we give to it through the plural of our languages. And by the way, there is also a scientific, secular version of the story told by our colleague here at Columbia, linguist John McWhorter, in his wonderful book, The Power of Babel, A Natural History of Language. Here is what he writes. I quote John McWhorter. The process by which one original language has developed into 6,000 is a rich and fascinating one, incorporating not only findings from linguistic theory, but also geography, history, and sociology. It is this fascination, he says in his introduction, this fascinating story that I will share with you in this book. The question the Babel myth poses is how we can speak the same language without using the same tongues. In other words, how we can ensure that the plurality of our languages, which is also the plurality of our perspectives on the world, does not fragment our humanity into tribes. There is a thesis implicit in George Steiner's classical work on the philosophy of translation and the title After Babel. What this title says is that embracing our post-Babel condition, like Sisyphus embraced his rock, we can turn around our condemnation by God and transform our dispersion in different languages into their encounter in translation. Translation will then be the common language. Umberto Eco spoke of translation as the language of Europe, but Ngugi wa Thiong'o has spoken of translation as the language of languages, more universal. It is in this sense that translating to overcome the multiplicity, synonymous with confusion, of our languages becomes an ethical project. After Babel starts the task of the translator. To take up here the message of an exhibition on translation that was presented by Barbara Cassin at Marseille's Museum 8 years ago now, under the title Après Babel, traduire. After Babel, well, translation. The theme around which this exhibition was organized was that of a reversal of Babel that transforms what was a curse into a mission and a task. The ethical mission to achieve humanity as a task and a responsibility after humanity as a natural given has been lost in tribal fragmentation. And this is one of the reasons why Ubuntu, as you said, Emmanuelle, is at the heart of my work. I love this word, this banal word, Bantu word, that was turned into a philosophical concept by Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, explaining two components that are actually built into this word. First, that human is not a given, it's not a state, it is a task. Humanity is something we have to achieve. To be human is to have the responsibility of becoming who we have to be, achieving our toti and einai, as Aristotle said in Greek. And second component, achieving humanity means achieving it together, in reciprocity, not in the isolation of your own chamber in a Cartesian way when you find out that I think, therefore I am, but in reciprocity, in relationship, in intersubjectivity. So we achieve our humanity, we have to achieve it, and we have to achieve it together. So I have two comments about this ethical mission here. The first one gets me back to the religious texts. I note that the biblical description of a humanity scattered over the face of the earth by the plurality of its languages is also Quranic. Actually, normally usually the Quran has the same narratives that you find in the Bible, but not for the Babel narrative. Still, this notion of our human condition being a post-Babylonian condition is present, and I'm thinking here, for example, of a verse from the Quran that says this: "We have made you nations and tribes so that you may know one another." So while there is no Babel narrative in the Quranic text, the notion expressed in this verse of humanity's fragmentation into tribes and therefore into languages goes in the same direction. Whether original or post-Babelic, our dispersion in the Babel of languages is a given. But what is added by the Quranic verse is that with it also comes the task of knowing each other, of achieving humanity together through the language of languages, that is translation. My second remark is that things are obviously not so simple. And if we look at history, we can see everything that can stand in the way of this reversal, and one could say against the optimism or maybe naivete of my title about hospitality of translation, that actual relations between languages are much more characterized by cultural hegemony than by what I have presented as a humanism of translation. Within Europe itself, the hierarchy of languages according to their genius has been the subject of debate, as we know from the famous question posed in 1783 by the Berlin Academy, to which Rivarol responded with his famous speech on the genius of the French language, which makes it universal, and more universal than German. I don't know what my good friend Andreas would say about that. But it was colonialism that transformed the claim to universality of certain languages into the reality of their imperial status. In this respect, colonialism has reproduced the great division made by the Greeks between their language, which was the logos in person, and those of the barbarian words, whose confusion or babel mirrored the one reigning in their minds. Achille Mbembe has rightly written that colonialism is monolingual. In other words, it is only natural that it should see its language as the tool for the moral conquest that alone can consolidate and perpetuate the colony's physical conquest. Moral conquest is the title given by Georges Hardy, the young and enthusiastic director of l'enseignement en Afrique occidentale Française, to the book he published in 1917, in which he indicated that the language of the colonial school would be the best tool for assimilating the races that, he said, chance has entrusted to us. assimilate them, in other words, take them out of the bubble to which they are confined, not only by their native languages, but also by the language of their Quranic school, if they are Muslims. It is no coincidence, then, that so many works of Francophone African literature have as their theme the so-called French school and its symbolic violence against traditional or Quranic education in Africa or elsewhere. One model of such novels is Cheikh Hamidou Khan's literary classic, L'Aventure ambiguë. Post-colonial vigilance, or can I say wokeness without lightning striking Columbia once again, calls the attention to the fact that there is a question of power at the heart of translation, and that in the context of colonialism particularly, we are dealing not with the equivalence of languages in translation, but with a master language and a servant language. In other words, with the logos of a colonizer and the dialect of a colonized subject. The post-colonial turn in translation theory means the need to look at the colonial encounter and examine the imbalance between the languages and cultures that are communicating through translation, bringing to light that cultural hegemony lies at the heart of translation also. That translation is primarily the translation by the colonizer of the dominated culture of the colonized. The figure of the ethno-linguist cannot be detached here from the colonial context. It is the case that Europe's universalism means its unquestioned capacity to translate other cultures into its own language. Thus, Emmanuelle Levinas writes in Humanism of the Other that, I quote, "The decried Western civilization knew how to understand cultures that never understood anything about themselves." The Levinas of totality and infinity, the Levinas that we love, is also the Levinas who wrote Humanism of the Other, where he just praised the exceptionalism and universalism of Europe and had to say that European universalism is founded upon the notion that Western civilization is not one among others, a language among languages, but the Logos itself. Europe, for him, simply cannot be a province of the world. Let's Depeche know that. Thanks to its verticality, and Levinas insists that verticality is a sine qua non of universality, European humanity, as Husserl called it, is naturally endowed with the anthropological vocation to understand particular cultures that never understood themselves. Therefore, it should not even need to formally colonize other people, because, as Levinas writes, culture and colonization do not necessarily go together. Central to the post-colonial turn in translation studies is the thesis that colonialism, in essence, is translation. That colonialism itself is a translation project is the demonstration which is conducted in the influential work by Tejaswini Niranjana, citing translation, history, post-structuralism, and the colonial context. So the question is translation in essence colonialism? It is through translation that what Congolese-American Valentin Mudimbe has called the colonial library is constituted. And when the colonized subjects themselves engage in the translation of their cultures and imaginaries into the imperial language, they are only adding to that colonial library. They are willing to serve the master and betray the culture that they are translating. In this case, translation is consent to colonialism, and the Italian proverb traduttore traditore, translation is betrayal, then conveys a more sinister meaning than the simple one it playfully suggests, namely that one has to cope with the fact that there is no absolute equivalence from language to language. In this context, the translator is accused of being either a dupe or a traitor. On this topic, there is an important essay by Mahasweta Sengupta about self-translation by the colonized. In her essay entitled Translation as Manipulation, The Power of Images and the Images of Power, she studies Rabindranath Tagore's self-translation of his work from Bengali into English and concludes that in the process, the poet manipulates his own poetry in order to suit the expectations of the colonizer's language. He manipulates because fundamentally he is manipulated by colonialism when he engages in the task of translating, into inventing in the sense that Mudimbe gives to the invention of Africa, into inventing himself as the figure of the saint from the East at a time of turmoil that was World War I. And in an important book that can be considered post-colonial, Pascal Casanova alludes to that study of Tagore in her work, La langue mondiale, traduction et domination. We cannot ignore that we have the hierarchy between what she calls hypercentral languages, central languages, and peripheral languages, questioning the equivalence of languages that are put in touch, to use Antoine Berman's phrase, or in a relationship of hospitality, as I say, following Paul Ricoeur. One translates up when one translates from a peripheral to a central language. I would translate up if I have my book translated by my good friend Dylan into English, but why would I translate into Wolof? This is particularly the case, she writes, in a situation of coloniality, characterized by diglossia, the co-presence of two languages, the central one or hypercentral one, colonial, and the often peripheral idiom of the native, a situation that is in an obvious manifestation of cultural domination. There is a certain difference between bilingualism, meaning that a subject masters two languages that can be considered equivalent, and diglossia, which is the situation of a community formally or actually dominated. In such a situation, the two languages are not equivalent. One, the imperial one, is the prestige language, while the use of the other, the indigenous one, is often confined to private interactions. In a situation of diglossia, to translate the poetry, the imaginary of one's culture into the imperial language is to translate up. And that is why self-translation inevitably marks submission and surrender to colonialism. Now, I have mentioned all these aspects of the post-colonial turn in translation studies to insist that I am not naive, and to insist that I do realize that humanism or the universal or hospitality of translation in my work sound out of sync, to say it mildly, with post-colonial or decolonial thought. Right from its title, my book seems to run counter to the lessons from such a post-colonial turn in the field of translation studies. Of course, speaking of hospitality brings to mind, in the French context, the philosopher Paul Ricoeur or the philosopher Antoine Berman, whose works are in the continuity of a tradition of philosophy and ethics of translation inaugurated by German thinkers Goethe, the Romantics, for example, Friedrich Schleiermacher. My point is that the politics, the anthropology, and the sociology of translation are not counterexamples to the ethical project that translation is. My book and my position are in continuity with that tradition of the ethical project of translation and do run counter a form of postcolonial ideology of a radical incommensurability and untranslatability of cultures, of identities, and languages. More generally, my thinking goes against certain binary simplifications that are sometimes presented as postcolonial, in particular, incommensurability against translation or particularism against the universal. What we learn from the politics and sociology of translation in a postcolonial approach, namely that all languages are not equal, does not negate the ethical and philosophical truth of translation as hospitality, and that languages are equivalent in translation. Translation creates equivalence, and in that sense, it is a humanism. In other words, I do acknowledge and recognize the sociological political approach. At the same time, I'm saying that if I do something that phenomenologists would call an epoche, bracketing out the context in order to look at the significance of just putting in touch two languages, then I am thinking about the ethical project that translation is, and then I am thinking of the humanism of translation. Translation is a figure of what I call, following Merleau-Ponty, a lateral universal. Humanity as the first universal is what I explore in Universaliser l'humanité par des moyens d'humanité, to universalize humanity by means of humanity. By the way, this is a quote from the founder of French socialism, or Socialist Party, which becomes both the Socialist Party and the Communist Party, Jean Jaurès, identifying the combat for humanity to the true significance of socialism. That would be the political import of what I'm trying to do. Emmanuelle Wallerstein, an alumni of Columbia, who in his own words decided to make Africa the focus of his intellectual concerns, and who presided the African Studies Association in 1973, has declared that our times mark the end of European universalism. He has added that that means we are now facing the task of forging a truly universal universal. I consider that to mean what French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty has called a lateral universal. And now I quote Merleau-Ponty directly. Here is what he says: "The equivalent of our social being can be dismantled and reconstructed by the voyage, as we are able to learn to speak other languages. This provides a second way to the universal, no longer the overarching universal of a strictly objective method, but a sort of lateral universal, which we acquire through ethnological experience and its incessant testing of the self through the other person, and the other person through the self." In his work, Humanism of the Other, Emmanuelle Levinas mocked, literally, this concept of a lateral or horizontal or diagonal universal as oxymoronic. In his view, the universal can only be understood as the verticality of a European orientation of the world. But that universalism, as Bruno has mentioned in his generous introduction, has ended with the Bandung Conference of 1955. The importance of that meeting is that it is the symbol of decolonization, even if the movement of decolonization obviously had already started. India, Pakistan, China, many countries were already independent at that day. The conference, not called by Europe and held in the absence of Europe, showed the configuration of a world in which Europe is no more the center, and which is that of the eruption on the scene of universal history, in Hegel's sense, of the pluralism of the world. Now, what the lateralism or the multilateralism of the universal says is that all cultures, all languages are all equivalent, all on the same plane of immanence, and equally invited to the elaboration of that truly universal universal. And that is the significance of the Bandung Conference. The Senegalese Alioune Diop, founder of the Présence Africaine publishing house, put it perfectly. To decolonize, he says, is not to decolonize against the universal, but to universalize. Décoloniser pour universaliser, he said. And he added, in order to universalize, it is crucial that all are present to the task of achieving humanity. Following Alioune Diop, I have chosen the verb and not a substantive in the subtitle of my book, Universaliser l'humanité par des moyens d'humanité. The verb indicates that the universal is a practice of universalizing, and that is what the 3 points made by Merleau-Ponty quote express, that I'm going to go through very quickly now in order to conclude. First, multilingualism or heteroglossia. The possibility of moving and thinking from language to language is an exercise in decentering. To engage in universalizing is like learning to speak other languages. It does not mean just adding, juxtaposing, or piling up languages that are external to one another, but it means more deeply broadening the experience of stepping outside oneself and seeing oneself and one's language through the eyes of another. The incessant testing of oneself by the other and of the other by oneself echoes here the title of Antoine Berman's book, L'épreuve de l'étranger, the test of the foreign. Second, the incessant testing means that there is always misunderstanding and untranslatability. Translation has also to deal with untranslatability. It is not the violence of assimilating the other, reducing the difference of the other to my own language. Because different languages are different perspectives on the word, different ways of being inscribed in the very flesh of the word, as phenomenologists say, translating, says Ricoeur, is both an impossible and a sublime task. Impossible because it brings together different experience of the word, making the task of translating always at the same time a work of mourning for what has not been able to make the crossing from a language to another in its original form. And the translation is sublime because it eventually always happens, the welcoming into one language of what has been thought and created in another language. Despite the heterogeneity of idioms, there are bilinguals, there are polyglots, there are interpreters, and there are translators. And all these people carry the message using Edouard Glissant's language that to translate is to open up to one another the opacities that cultures are. Important to mention that they are opacities. They cannot be just assimilated into an homogeneous word, but they are open opacities, as Glissant forges this concept. Third, to say that each human experience conveyed by a given language can enter into a broader experience, in principle accessible to people from another country and another time, is to say that what enables and promotes such accessibility is our shared human condition. It is to reaffirm against a prison-like conception of identity these words by the Senegalese poet and thinker Léopold Sédar Senghor, inviting to always, I quote, measure the pride of being different against the happiness of being together. Thank you very much. Thank you.
mics that are circulating, and I will moderate. I will start.
My grandchildren have been perfect. They listen to their grandpa.
Can you hear me? I have the first question, which is it's about your philosophy of history and about your politics, the politics that are behind this reflection. You tell us, right? You have this kind of phenomenological approach, the epoche, the verbal-cognitive vision of this tension between the lateral universalism and the universalism from above. And at the same time, you speak to us about history. You speak to us about Bandung. You speak to us about Georges Hardy, la conquête morale des indigènes, etc. Right? And so I'm wondering about how they fit together and how, and in a time like now, where it feels like we are more stuck in differences than we are in commonalities, when we are more attached to or stuck again in projections of asymmetries of power. What does your approach have to say? How do we, is the solution the revolution? A moment when the universality is really going to be reached? Or is the universalism a constant, never-ending strife or project or horizon for us?
Yes, it is. Let me start with the end of what I was, this final aspect, and I go back to the notion of universal history. It is an open-ended question, yes. And this is why at one point I connected lateralism, to use the concept of Merleau-Ponty, and multilateralism, which is a concept of international relations, which seems to have died today. And so it is this idea of, yes, coming together and being engaged in a continuous open-ended negotiation about what universalizing means. We have done that in 1948. Our colleague, former colleague, Sam Moyne, wrote a wonderful piece on human rights. And one of the questions he asked, are we going to say that human rights started with the Stoics, or Christianity, or the French Revolution, or the American Bill of Rights, etc., or 1948? It is 1948. Why? Because 1948 you had many nations coming together. Although African countries were not independent at that time, only 3 countries were who attended the conference, the founding conference of 1948, Ethiopia, Liberia, Sierra Leone. Symbolically, somehow, United Nations in general were present. And they negotiated this from very different perspectives. What the USSR was bringing on the table was different from the perspective of the Americans, which was different from the perspective of Saudi Arabia, was different, etc., etc. But in the end, they came up with a document that they did not call international, but universal. Universalism came out of it. And imperfect as it is, this might be a model of what we try to put under the concept of universalizing together. And to follow what Alioune Diop said, it is important that everybody is present in the work, in the task of achieving humanity together. Now, about universal history and where I'm coming from, I did not have, of course, the space to say everything I had in mind. But one aspect, important aspect, is that, in a way, Bandung ended universal history as constructed by Hegel. At the end, I mean, this notion that I studied philosophy within this frame, according to which philosophy started in Greece, came out the Greek miracle, continued through antiquity, medieval time, and just through Europe. And this was a construction, a fabrication, not an old one, because the Greeks did not think that they were the inventors of philosophy. Descartes mentioned that the matrix of his system was something that was coming from foreign origin and a foreign name, which was algebra, which is an Arabic word. Leibniz admired China and considered that Chinese ideograms would be a model. They were open. And the closure and this invention of universal history happening only in Europe was really a fabrication of Hegel at a time when history of philosophy was becoming a discipline, a philosophical discipline. So this beautiful idea, I mean, he becomes a poet when he talks about the exceptionalism of Europe, Europe being the Occident, where as opposed to the Orient, and saying that the Occident, when the sun actually sets, is much more beautiful than the place where the sun rises. It is poetically beautiful, but just false. So, and Bandung just ended that narrative centered on Europe. And this is why history is at the background of what I was saying, and thank you for bringing that.
There was a question here.
Hi, Salim.
In praise of the universal, says the Spinozist philosopher and Muslim, you are, who says, Alhamdulillah, praise be to God. Is universal a name of God for you?
I mentioned lightning striking Colombia, so I have to be very careful here when I talk about God. Well, yeah, I have a tendency to believe that he is a universal God, meaning that he is also pluralistic. I believe in the horizon of universality. In other words, the universal is not something that we are seeking in spite of the pluralism, but within the pluralism and with the pluralism as well. So, and somehow, well, you mentioned Islam, and it is probably something that would explain why my position vis-a-vis universal is the position it is. Because when, for example, we have this decolonial thinking about epistemologies from the global south, for example, which is a very important program that we have, dealing with epistemologies from the global south and not just Western epistemology. And we may mention, for example, that the narrative of philosophy being quintessentially and uniquely Western is challenged by the fact that you do have Islamic philosophy that actually Hegel dismissed. Hegel could not ignore that in the history of philosophy you had names, barbaric names such as Ibn Rushd, Averroes, or Ibn Sina, and so on and so forth. So he had to deal with those names, especially if someone like Thomas Aquinas spends every other page praising the commentator, and the commentator in question being Ibn Rushd. But he was quick to say they cannot be philosophers because they have a religion of fanaticism, and also their language cannot handle philosophy because they do not speak Greek or German. So that is actually, again, a false narrative, because the translatio studii, and Bruno reminded us that in his introduction, did not just go the path Athens, Rome, Heidelberg, or London or Paris. It went as well through Baghdad, Nishapur, Cordoba, Fez, or Timbuktu, at the heart of West Africa. So that is probably my idea of universalism, because that philosophy was born out of translation. When they were confronted with Greek philosophy, you had two possible attitudes. One would say, why do we get interested in the wisdom or the love of wisdom of these people if they did not know the universal God, the one God and the God of revelation? They can't have a wisdom that might be of interest to us. But fortunately, you had other people who would understand the true meaning of identity. The idea that maybe the shortest way from myself to myself goes through the other. That is the significance of Ubuntu. This is why Islam or Islamic philosophy was born out of translation. So this translational notion of decolonizing philosophy or decolonizing science, of decolonizing epistemology is mine, and it probably comes from that background of mine. Yeah.
You really asked a question that I was going to ask, but I was going to shift a step further. Bachir, as you know, one of the things I'm very interested in these days is, or many of us are, is reconsidering the history of philosophy that's been a series of beats on a string, and we want to take them off and put them in a wider context. But having said that, I'll mention one of our favorite philosophers, Leibniz. And in picking up on I would like to hear you clarify a bit, or say a bit more about the underlying metaphysics of this, like an account of what there really is, and truly the divinity is a role here. But one of the points that Leibniz makes, and many that there's a suggestion of this in Spinoza and the woman I'm working on now, Antonwe, that the world is constituted of an infinity of things. Humanity is in some sense part of that infinite beauty of the world. But in order to find, I think they would all say, a kind of universalism, requires an understanding of what Leibniz sometimes calls sympathetic harmony, that we are all like, that every single thing is in some sense a reflection of everything else. And I just wonder if that is an underlying assumption to your account, and if not, why not?
Well, it definitely is, and I would like to run by you this idea that I had in the back of my mind, speaking of Leibniz, not now his algebra of logic, the technical side of it, but truly his metaphysics. And I am thinking that what Edouard Glissant has called these open opacities could be very much translated into the language of Leibniz monadology. The word as an infinity of monads. And as he puts it, monads have neither doors nor windows. So they are, in that sense, opacity. But at the same time, they are open through the monad of monads, the universal God of Salim. And in that sense, they communicate. Each monad expresses all the other monads in the totality of the universe. And this is what is so beautifully mystical in Leibniz metaphysics as well. And I was thinking of that, yes, and the infinite nature of the word would be the infinity of that monadology of Leibniz, I would say.
Merci beaucoup. Permettez-moi, trop cher professeur, de m'exprimer en français.
La langue des dieux.
Merci. Je voudrais d'abord vous remercier pour la qualité de votre exposé. Et malgré le fait que mon anglais ne soit pas très bon, j'ai quand même compris. Je pense avoir compris. Et la question que je me pose, c'est que je suis parfaitement d'accord avec vous là-dessus. C'est que quand on traduit la langue d'autrui, on s'approprie une partie de sa culture, et c'est ce qui crée l'universalisme. Mais aujourd'hui, le questionnement que j'ai, c'est qu'on tombe de plus en plus sur l'intelligence artificielle qui fait tout le travail à notre place. Et cette appropriation, je pense que avec l'intelligence artificielle, est-ce que ça ne va pas poser problème? Est-ce une bonne ou une mauvaise chose pour l'humanité? Moi, c'est la question que je me pose. Merci.
C'est la question. It is probably the question that we are all asking ourselves. What is going to happen with translation given AI, artificial intelligence? And I think that if I say I'm not sure, I could add that nobody is sure, actually. We used to say that the machine could not translate at all. I remember I have enough gray hair to remember a time when a good friend of mine, who was a computer science engineer, was saying machine will not translate. This was before the 1990s, because they were basically trying to solve the enigma of what meaning is. So how would machine deal with meaning? You know, you feed them with dictionaries, with grammar, with blah, 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 and trying to solve the enigma of meaning. And very quickly, they just changed their mind. They are not looking for meaning anymore, but just accumulating data, and big data, and having this huge plagiarism that is premised on the idea that everything has already been translated. You just need to find the source of that. And it looks like it is working. I mean, when we translate using DeepL, or I don't know what people are using, it is better and better. You have to just work a little bit on it. So I'm just looking at that and looking at all the consequences, because it means, and it is happening now, that many publishers are not bothering with translators and paying them what they should be paying them, but using AI and asking them to just check the translation made by the machine, which is another catastrophe that we have to deal with. I mean, the conquest was to have the names of translators on the cover, along with the name of the author. I'm so happy that in our book, Dylan and I have our names on the cover, as it should be. But at the same time, yes, there is the threat coming from artificial intelligence, and I don't know what is going to happen with that. Yeah.
Thank you. If you don't mind, I'll ask my question in Buddha. So I was just can I come back to Leibniz and this notion of opacity? It seems to me that your idea, and I mean, a way to understand the Quranic verse you cited is that it's not that really God reflects onto the world or onto the monads, but that every monad has a part of, a specific part, and is a very specific way of participating into the building of the sense. Don't you?
It is the case. And that is what is fantastic with Leibniz. A monad only deals with itself. That is what the image of the monads having no door and no window would mean. But in dealing with itself, the monad that I am is dealing with the monad Bashir. The monad that you are is dealing with the monad Hadi. But what we were reminded of by Christia about pre-established harmony means that things are in such a way that our change, the evolution of the monads that we are, meant to have us all in this very room today. This was pre-established, and pre-established harmony. Don't you feel the harmony? in Polar and in Wolof, etc., and that is what universality is.
Thank you very much. Hi, Bachir, thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. I was wondering what could be the political translation of your theory of translation, which means, because when I listen to you, there is a word that always comes, and I would love to ask you if you could foster this idea, the idea of socialism, and it comes all the time, and many thinkers that you are just in your books and who you are thinking with, like Samihani, Emmanuelle, even Senghor, they were all trying to give a certain content to this idea of socialism in a Marxist way sometimes, or in an anti-Marxist way. And I would love to know how your idea of translation is connecting you perhaps to a new understanding of socialism or not, if it makes sense to say that.
Absolutely. I mean, that idea of a translational understanding of socialism and oriented towards humanism is something that I share with my good friend Gary Wilder, who could not be with us, as you know. And it is very important. This is why I reminded us that the subtitle of my book, Universalism, is a quote from Jean Jaurès. You know, the kind of socialism I have in mind when I connect the goal of humanity, as he puts it. Let me go back to the origin of that quote. This is the first issue of the daily newspaper that Jean Jaurès created, with the title L'Humanité, Humanity, which is still now the newspaper of the French Communist Party. And in that, when he created that newspaper, he wrote the editorial, the introduction, in the first issue, and he called it Our Goal. So meaning that our goal is humanity, and that goal of humanity is identified with socialism in his mind. That idea that socialism is humanism, in the sense that we are fragmented by inequality, by our differences, we are tribes, and the goal is to make us one single humanity. Very optimistic. He died from that optimism. As you know, he was killed because he was a pacifist. But he believed in this humanist and spiritualist way of understanding socialism as building humanity, which means that it is not just singing together a kumbaya or we are the world, we are the children, etc., but really fighting for it and fighting against everything that prevents that is an impediment, which is inequality. So that notion of humanism is something that has disappeared at one point in the so-called scientific socialism. And I must say that I have followed my old mentor, Althusser, in that direction at one time. Althusser is the one who said that socialism should be constructed as a science of history against all the humanist and ethical concepts that the young Marx, the Marx before 1844, had been using. The concept of alienation, building humanity against everything that is actually pulling down and pulling apart human beings. And in order to become who we truly have to be, one humanity and the homo artifex, the human artist, who is able to express all her talents. So that had disappeared at one point. And somehow I have nostalgia for that idea of socialism, spiritualist one, humanist one, and not the one that died, thanks God, with the fall of the Berlin Wall.
I'm sorry, one last question. We have tons of time in the next 2 days for more questions. One last question.
Hello,
Well, first and foremost, thank you for this talk. I just have one question, which is Fanon states a man who possesses the language possesses as an indirect consequence the world expressed and implied by this language. How does this harmonize with the ethical project of translation?
Absolutely, it's a beautiful quote from Frantz Fanon. Yes, a language is the word in a way, and but having a language is in a way having a new perspective on the word. When that's something I tried to say in my presentation. When you are a bilingual, it is as if you can inhabit two words at the same time. For one, you can look at your language from the outside and understand it. Goethe famously said, if you have only one language, you don't know it. Because you have no comparison possible. You have no outside of your language from which to look at your language. And the only outside of a language is another language. So this capacity to decenter yourself is the beauty of thinking from language to language. Thinking in Pular and from Pular to English or English and French, as Adi does on a daily basis. And this is exactly the beauty of the quote from Fanon, and thank you for bringing that Fanon. And by the way, the Fanon that we should be reading, to whom we should be fair, is the universalist Fanon. There is a Fanon invented in the binaries of postcolonialism, forgetting that Fanon, at the end of Peau Noire, Masque Blanc, and at the end of Les Damnés de la Terre, is calling for a universal. And in that sense, I am also a Fanonian.
Wow.
Merci.